Hey everyone, welcome to the Liam McCullum Show, a podcast by Human Reaction, where I interview leading voices on hot button issues to arm you with the truth and advance liberty. In today's podcast, I have my great friend Ethan Holmes with me to react to Tucker Carlson's great new interview with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Ethan just wrote this great article published on antiwar.com titled, "Is Tucker Carlson America's Top Diplomat?" Ethan is one of my favorite people to talk to. I first met him during my freshman year of college. We both went to the same school in Montana. He grew up here, and we instantly bonded over libertarianism, his love of Russian culture, Dostoevsky novels, and sound foreign policy. Since graduating college, he went on to teach students in Russia. He came back during COVID, and he actually was my roommate. And he continued working as a journalist with Sputnik News while living in the United States. And unfortunately, because of the Biden administration's desire to silence opponents to the war in Ukraine, he was forced out of his job at Sputnik with the threat of financial penalties or criminal charges. Yes, for the crime of journalism. He wrote about his time at Sputnik in a great article published at antiwar.com, which I'll link in the description. Please go support him by following at @the_posts on X. He is a great advocate for peace and prosperity, and I really hope you enjoy this interview with him. Here's Ethan.
Liam McCullum, really one of the brightest young minds in the liberty movement, one of our rising stars.
Ethan, thanks again for joining me. It's always great to talk to you. How are you doing?
Excellent, Liam. Thank you for having me on as always. It's always a pleasure. Your setup's looking better than ever. And I'm happy to be here. How about you? What's new in life with all this new podcast and school activity?
Well, this is my third official podcast with the Human Reaction crew. So, I mean, all of this nice equipment is credit to them, and that I'm officially in partnership with them. And I highly recommend that everyone should check out my previous episodes that I've done so far. I recorded one with Scott Horton and Angela McCardle, and they seem to be doing pretty well. So I'm excited to keep doing this. And I've been meaning to get you on the show for a while. And Tucker Carlson earlier this week announced that he was interviewing Sergei Lavrov. And I figured this was perfect time to have you on. I love talking to you about this stuff. And you actually wrote this piece for antiwar.com about how Tucker Carlson might be America's top diplomat. And it really is a great piece, and everyone should go read it. You essentially make the case that Tucker is doing the job that Antony Blinken should be doing. So, I was just thinking, just how bad has it gotten that, we used to revere JFK for talking to Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But as we'll show later in this interview, it was unveiled that Blinken and Biden haven't even had conversations with their counterparts. So I do think you kind of have hit it on the nose that we now have to rely on a fired Fox News host to heroically do our diplomacy for us.
Yeah, well, Scott and Angela are a really hard act to follow, but I'm really happy to be here and to discuss my article. Shout out to antiwar.com. Check out the sticker there on Liam's laptop. They're a really great publication. They publish, tons of great articles every day, every week. So I'm blessed to be among them. And, the timing was great. I submitted it the evening that Tucker Carlson announced the interview, like he's tended to recently. He kind of foreshadows the interview to come, gives the shot with him in front of the Kremlin. And then the day that it ended up releasing, which wasn't exactly known, was the day the article came out. And I think it made a really compelling point, especially for those who ended up watching the full interview, that Tucker Carlson is having more substantial, more authentic and sincere conversations with Russian government officials than apparently anyone in the United States government is. And even though Tucker Carlson has these ties to the incoming administration, he's certainly not a friend of the Biden administration. But it does seem that he is a friend of peace and diplomacy and doing what he can in his role as a journalist and a political commentator to bridge this gap, this communications and information divide between Russians and Americans. It's not often that we as average American citizens get to hear directly from Russian officials, especially in such good English that Lavrov has. And sadly, it goes the other way too. I don't think U.S. leaders have these sorts of conversations with Russian outlets either, for a variety of reasons. And so the Russian people are being deprived in that way as well. But I'm thankful for Tucker doing what he has to foster dialogue in a very communication scarce environment.
Yeah, and of course, Tucker did a previous interview with Putin, and we reacted to that, and everyone should go check out our previous podcasts on that. But it is really great and just unbelievable that no one has attempted to do this. You would think that our journalistic class, if they actually cared about the truth, would have done this years ago. But this war is almost 3 years on, and it's just crazy that this is the first time that most Americans have even heard this side of the conflict. But we also did learn a lot during this interview, which I found very interesting. Like you said, the fact that there really hasn't been any communication at all. Lavrov himself admits, and I want to play the clip here, where he essentially says he has not talked to Blinken at all.
Who do you think has been making foreign policy decisions in the United States? This is a question in the United States. Who's making these decisions?
I wouldn't guess. I haven't seen Tony Blinken for years. 2 years ago, I think, at the G20 summit, was it in Rome or somewhere? In the margins. His assistant, I was representing Putin, and his assistant came up to me during a meeting and said that Tony wants to talk just for 10 minutes. I left the room, we shook hands, and he said something about the need to de-escalate and so on and so forth. I hope he is not going to be angry with me since I am disclosing this. But we were meeting in front of many people present in the room. And I said, we don't want to escalate. You want to inflict strategic defeat upon Russia. He said, no. It is not strategic defeat globally. It is only in Ukraine.
You've not spoken to him since?
No.
Have you spoken to any officials in the Biden administration since then?
I don't want to ruin their career.
But have you had meaningful conversations?
No. Not at all. No, when I met in international events, one or another person whom I know, an American, I mean.
Yeah.
Some of them say hello, some of them exchange few words, but I never impose myself. Because
but nothing meaningful behind the scenes.
It's becoming contagious, when they see, when somebody sees an American talking to me or a European talking to me. Europeans are running away when they see me. During the last G20 meeting, it was ridiculous. Grown-up people, mature people, they behave like kids, so childish.
And that really was the moment of the debate that I think was most impactful for me is, we kind of knew that if any communications were happening, they were through back channels. But I mean, just to hear it from his words that he so clearly would like to talk to his counterparts and they're completely unwilling. I remember one of the first times I interviewed you about this conflict, I recalled something that Biden had said where it was just a couple of weeks or maybe a couple months into the war. And he said, I don't want to talk to Putin right now. And it was just such a childish response. And I remember bringing that up in one of our first interviews. But yeah, so what do you make of that?
I think that keyword there that you used and Lavrov used, childish, is very accurate. What you should reasonably expect from diplomats, from people whose entire job is to make peace, broker peace, foster communications and ties between even adversarial countries. You expect them to be incredibly mature, incredibly professional, incredibly accepting and open to experience and dialogue. And at least by Lavrov's account and what we've seen in the public record, it seems as though the Biden administration's State Department, well, not just the Biden administration, I mean, the Obama administrations, in some ways, the Trump administration's State Departments, they all are playing schoolyard politics with their diplomacy. You know, they're not talking to their Russian counterparts with the seriousness and frequency that they should, just because they don't like them, because they think it's taboo, because they're afraid it might harm their career reputations or their social reputations. And frankly, it is just sad and ridiculous. Not that I don't understand why someone would be uncomfortable or intimidated speaking with someone of Lavrov's prowess. I mean, he is a top Russian official. He's a longtime Russian official. He's an incredibly experienced diplomat. It'd be rough to go toe-to-toe with him in one of these official forum settings or even on the margins like Blinken did. But that's what we pay our diplomats to do. That's what we appoint them to these positions to do. And so to hear that they are not pursuing communication with our, closest nuclear adversary and with an adversary that we are increasingly coming into conflict with in multiple ways, below and above the threshold of violence. It's unfortunate. And I really expect better from the incoming Trump administration. And we'll probably get into it later. But by Lavrov's account, it seems as though he's likewise cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, so Tucker does ask him another question about the communication that they've had, and I just figured we should play that clip as well.
The fact that we're having a conversation about a potential nuclear exchange and it's real is remarkable. Not something I thought I'd ever see. And it raises the question, how much back-channel dialogue is there between Russia and the United States? Has there been for the last 2.5 years? Is there any conversation ongoing?
There are several channels, but mostly on exchange of people who serve terms in Russia and in the United States.
He means going to prison. It's a very Russian way to say go to prison terms.
There are also channels which are not advertised or publicized, but basically the Americans send through these channels the same message which they send publicly. You have to stop. You have to accept the way which will be based on the Ukrainian needs and Ukrainian position. They support this absolutely pointless peace formula by Zelensky, which was additioned recently by Victory Plan.
Again, just reiterating that there's little conversation at all happening, but also I think an added point that they're hearing the exact same things that we're hearing, these just prepackaged policy stances that you might hear from a Secretary of State briefing. There's not actually any conversations that are having.
And that was disappointing, although unsurprising to hear. On some level, I'd like to believe that somewhere in the background, people were exchanging meaningful messages, that maybe there was some more flexible and open-minded talk going on behind the scenes compared to what they're putting out in these public messages. But once again, by Lavrov's account, that is entirely untrue. And so that shattered a little bit of the hope remaining that I had in this current diplomatic corps.
Yeah. Well,
although he did say earlier, and I thought it was really interesting, at least to note, how he said he didn't want to ruin people's careers by revealing, some of these smaller, albeit insignificant talks, but people who are at least trying in some small way. But he recognizes that in the current U.S. establishment politics, for many of these people's careers, it could be a death sentence for it to get public, for it to get widely to receive wide attention that they're talking with Russian officials in any way other than cookie cutter demands and PR talking points.
Yeah, that is interesting. I wonder if that was just a slight, or if he actually does have respect for them.
I'm sure there is someone out there who knew exactly what he was talking about. Yeah, it was probably directed at someone in particular. But so the first question that Tucker asks him is really about whether Russia and the United States are directly at war. And this is what Lavrov had to say.
Do you believe the United States and Russia are at war with each other right now?
I wouldn't say so. And in any case, this is not what we want. We would like to have normal relations with all our neighbors, of course, but generally with all countries on earth, especially with the great country like the United States. President Putin repeatedly expressed his respect for the American people, for the American history, for the American achievements in the world. And we don't see any reason why Russia and the United States cannot cooperate for the sake of the universe.
I love that line about cooperating for the sake of the universe.
Yeah, I like that too. And it reminded me, so you have talked about just the similarities between U.S. and Russian history in the past and culture, and how, Putin has talked about the desire to have good relationships with the United States, and how, Scott Horton in his book Provoked, when I interviewed him, he talked about the fact that, Putin had actually offered, to help Bush after the 9/11 attacks, and how there has been these kind of reaching out of hands by Russia. So I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about that again, about like the shared culture and the opportunity that is there between the two countries.
Yeah. So as Lavrov noted, I think that most of Russian society and Russian leadership does have a genuine respect for American history, American achievement and prowess. And where they have problems with the issue lies in that they don't feel as though the U.S. respects them as a fellow peer on the world stage, as someone that they can work with as partners, instead of, Russia being under their thumb, being a junior partner at best. I believe Lavrov mentions this later in the interview as well. But for much of America's early history, right after the American Revolution, up through about the turn into the 20th century, American society at large was much more positive towards Russia. Russia was, although in somewhat subtle ways, they were backers of the American Revolution. They did not take Britain's side, even though Britain requested Russian military aid. They actively denied it. Catherine the Great was a fan of Voltaire and all these Enlightenment ideas that were shared by the founding fathers. Both Russia and America are these coast to coast, ocean to ocean nations that have greatly expanded, have great natural resources and natural beauty, who have this big framework that includes, native peoples, people of European descent, people from all over the world. The Russian Empire is one of the most multi-ethnic empires that the world has ever seen. And Russia to this day continues to be a very multi-ethnic federation. And so there are lots of similarities in the geography of America and Russia. Although Russian history is way longer, there are similarities between Russian and American history. And our people have a lot in common, too. We are smart, hardworking people at our core. We're people who are skeptical of faith in some ways, but also deeply tied to the religious tradition in others. Before the Cold War, before the rise of the Soviet Union and now the current relationship between the Russian and the U.S., there was lots of optimism about the U.S. and Russia cooperating on the world stage, being two true behemoths in international relations, in economic ties. Much of Siberia was explored for the first time by Americans and charted by Americans in an effort to set up a telegraph line all the way across Siberia, over Alaska, through the coast, over to connect to Europe through St. Petersburg. And so our histories are intertwined in ways I think we've definitely lost sight of, at least on the American side. But when I was over in Russia, when I was over in Siberia, I never felt as though someone disrespected me just because I was an American. They'd make their jokes about America not having a, well-developed culture and whatnot. But you could tell that they were as happy and interested to meet someone from America as I was to meet someone from this very similar cousinly country of Russia.
And despite these potential ties, unfortunately, what came up in this interview is that Russia had to send a message to the West, and with this unveiling of the hypersonic missiles. And I wanted to actually share a video of the hypersonic missiles being used for people who haven't seen it, because it is pretty terrifying. And here's a tweet from Medvedev, former president of Russia. And what's his current position?
I'm going to be totally honest that I can't recall what he's doing nowadays. But
it is a big deal.
Executive level position. I think he led the parliament for a bit there in Russia.
And either way, it's a huge
been
deal.
A long time Putin ally. Yeah.
Right. And it's a huge deal that he's like former president. So yeah, it says here.
Yeah, executive position on the Security Council of Russia. So he's kind of like their Jake Sullivan, you could say.
But here is the attack. And he says, see, that's what you wanted, or so that's what you wanted. Well, you've damn well got it. A hypersonic ballistic missile attack. So what is the significance of this and the fact that it was actually used in Ukraine?
Yeah, so my understanding is that it was just a test of an intermediate range missile system. So that is to say, it's not an intercontinental ballistic missile, although it is much faster, and that's the whole problem. I don't want to get into a detailed deep dive into hypersonics and why they're so scary and important in current military conflicts and the technological arms race going on. But essentially, it boils down to they are very difficult to stop. Current defense systems are not really equipped to handle them. And so if you want to quickly deliver something with a very high probability of it hitting its target directly without interference, hypersonics are what countries are after. And the US, Russia, China, to a lesser extent, countries like North Korea, and some US NATO allies have all been involved in developing these. And from my understanding, while the US does it fairly well, they've had their number of failed tests. Russia, China, they've all had failed tests, but it appears Russia and China are far more focused on developing a lot of these hypersonic missiles than the US has been, and seem to be having, in some people's assessments, greater success with their hypersonics programs. So doing any level of missile testing, whether that be intermediate, intercontinental, they all kind of send the same message, which is that don't forget what we are capable of. Russia, by conducting these tests, by showing off what's in their arsenal, they are reminding the US and all of its European allies that they are no more than a couple minutes away from being struck with conventional or nuclear warheads. Although, as Lavrov pointed out, some people in the Biden administration are under the delusion that the US would go untouched in the event of a nuclear conflict with Russia, and that Europe would soak up 100% of the nukes, which is just the most bafflingly idiotic thing that I could hear come from the mouth of a so-called national security expert.
And I have that clip here. I'll play it.
Kirby, who is White House communications coordinator or whatever, he was answering questions, and about escalation and about possibility of nuclear weapons being employed. And he said, oh, no, we don't want escalation, because then if there is some nuclear element, then our European allies would suffer. So even mentally, he excludes that the United States can suffer. And this is something which makes the situation a bit risky. It might, if this mentality prevails, then some reckless steps could be taken, and this is bad.
So what I think you're saying is American policymakers imagine there could be a nuclear exchange that doesn't directly affect the United States, and you're saying that's not true.
That's what I said, yes.
Yeah, and as I've talked about with Scott Horton before, and I believe we talked about this in my last interview with him, is Montana in particular would be one of the first targets in this attack. And in all the simulations of nuclear war, Scott's done multiple interviews on this where there are not limited strikes. As soon as there are multiple attacks, at least from the U.S. point of view, with mutual assured destruction, all the nukes go off. And being that Montana and the surrounding states are considered the nuclear sponge in the nuclear doctrine of the United States, being that, we have the land-based leg of the nuclear triad system. The whole purpose is to basically coax Russia into attacking the states like Montana, the rural states, instead of the coast. So, this clip is unfortunate to hear. But I am wondering, so I have heard the case that, Russia does have a different nuclear doctrine than the United States, that they actually don't believe in mutual assured destruction, and that they actually leave room for, tactical nuclear strikes. And I'm wondering what you think of that. Is that true?
Yes. So Russia actually just recently updated its nuclear doctrine. And it's been kind of, along these lines for a while now, but they really cemented it. And that is that they consider an attack by a non-nuclear state backed by nuclear states to be a potential existential threat and potentially across the red line that it would take to deploy weapons. Now, this may have been what Kirby was hinting at, John Kirby, the person that Lavrov referenced there. When it came to the nuclear strike, he may have been thinking, the first obvious targets in a nuclear war would be tactical nukes against targets in Ukraine, maybe, short range tactical nukes somewhere in Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, whatever it may be. And so in that sense, you could limit nuclear war in certain scenarios to just Europe. But obviously, as you talked about in many simulations, things don't always go as planned or simulated. And that's really, in my mind, one of, if not the most worrying parts about this general lack of communication between the United States and Russia, diplomatically, militarily, at these executive levels, is one of the few remaining mechanisms of communication that go on right now are missile test alert notices. So, for example, when Russia held its recent missile test, they sent a message 30 minutes in advance saying, this is a test missile, don't interpret this as we're doing a first strike against you. And so that way the US can track it, they can make sure that their systems don't go haywire when they detect it. But the whole problem, as history has demonstrated, and we've so ever by the skin of our teeth avoided, is these systems can malfunction. We can have false detections. We can have anomalies that lead systems and leaders to believe that nuclear war is happening or is imminent. And if we don't have solid lines of communication pre-existing, if we don't have these relationships and these dialogues fostered over the course of a whole administration, then in those moments where there are anomalies or errors, we risk actually nuking ourselves more than ever because we haven't built any level of trust and we've built up this paranoia and this us versus them so strongly. So even though we are communicating in this realm of missile tests, this military to military communication, the lack of non-military communication in general puts us at risk of not having those backup lines, that safety net in the event that we have, a false launch detection or something along those lines.
Right. And the story that we tell ourselves, in history classes and public education and all of that, like the myth that we learn about the Cuban Missile Crisis is that JFK was heroic enough to, get the Russians to back down and have these conversations. But the key difference is that we were in a Cold War, not in a hot war. And currently the United States is funding direct missile attacks into Russia, and they're not talking. So the circumstances are completely different, and we're probably closer to, a nuclear event like that or a miscommunication than we were even during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's much worse because we don't even know who our president is right now because the last guy was unfit to run. So, yeah,
there are skeptics out there who dismiss the potential of nuclear war simply because it hasn't happened in the 70 odd years or whatever it's been since we invented nuclear weapons. And that's a fair point. The odds of nuclear war are not particularly high. But the problem is you only need to have it happen once. That's the whole problem. So even though it's never happened before, and it's, let's just say, a 0.5% chance, a 1% chance of happening. Okay, if that bumps up to 2 or 3%, that is a very, very, very bad probability to have in a situation where it only needs to go wrong one single time to have global thermonuclear war. And so this illusion that because we've been safe, we are safe, it's just not logically sound. I can respect the argument, that our pre-existing channels are enough, that we're doing the work, we've put in the necessary effort, everyone understands, but I'm not convinced everyone understands. That's the whole problem. It only takes one person at the top of the chain or a click at the top of either chain who is convinced of the imminence and the possibility of nuclear war that they push the button. And so the whole odds game isn't something that I mess with when it comes to nuclear war. Once again, do I even think there's the odd that it wouldn't escalate to a full arsenal exchange between the US and Russia? Sure, I see scenarios where that's the case. But do we really want to start treading even remotely close to that pathway? Any responsible diplomatic mind would say no.
Well, and the defense that most have been making, this new talking point that we're hearing, and Lavrov does mention this, is that, you know, Russia has set multiple red lines, and every time we've crossed it, they have yet to actually launch a nuclear weapon. I think the one that comes to mind is Piers Morgan in one of the Scott Horton interviews. He made this argument that, you know, like, he's bluffing. Putin is just bluffing. And Lavrov at one point says that that's just mistaken. And I wanted to play this clip here where he's talking about the message that this missile test was supposed to send to the West.
However, we also know that some officials in the Pentagon and in other places, including NATO, they started saying in the last few days something like, well, NATO is a defensive alliance, but sometimes you can strike first because the attack is the best defense. Some others in Stratcom, I think Buchanan is his name, representative of Stratcom, he said something which allows for an eventuality of exchange of limited nuclear strikes. And this kind of threats are really worrying, because if they are following the logic which some Westerners have been pronouncing lately, that, well, don't believe that Russia has red lines, they announce their red lines, these red lines are being moved again and again and again, this is a very serious mistake. That's what I would like to say in response to this question. It is not us who started the war. Putin repeatedly said that we started the operation in order to end the war which Kiev regime was conducting against its own people in the parts of Donbass.
You know, that's it's interesting to hear from Lavrov on a couple different accounts there. On one hand, I will admit that Russia has not been particularly firm with previous red lines. Not that they've made that like drastic of red lines with that hard of a pronouncement before. But people have to remember that everyone thought the buildup of Russian troops outside of Ukraine there right before they launched the invasion was just a bluff and just an exercise, and that surely they weren't going to, you know, act on it. I was among them. I really truly thought that Putin was just bluffing. But as Lavrov also recounted in this interview, it was in early 2022 where Putin had some sort of self-realization moment that the West and Russia were simply never going to, again, be in a position to fully cooperate and work together and resolve very tense issues, and that he had to take decisive action with the special military operation. And so in that sense, that was a red line. You know, there was the Niet means Niet memo. That line was, you know, arguably already crossed, if not just on a very clear trajectory to be crossed. And Putin acted. Now, I've received flack from both sides, you know, very pro-Russian and very pro-Ukrainian people. And the very pro-Russian side has criticized me for saying that I didn't think the special military operation, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, was wholly entirely justified. That I really truly believe in my heart of hearts that it didn't have to come to that at that time. But I'm also enough of a realist, a geopolitical realist, to understand and empathize with why Putin had to make that decision. There was red lines, there was strategic, you know, arguably existential security issues being threatened. And so he took drastic action. And that's where this whole series of escalation really started to ramp up. And I will also push back on the NATO first strike line. I didn't do a full deep dive and couldn't find the exact original quote from this NATO military committee chair that he's quoting as saying that he pitched a first strike. My understanding is that he was talking about taking immediate in Russia strikes if Russia attacks NATO assets. Either it's not clear if he means in Ukraine or in Europe proper. But I couldn't find the exact quote from a NATO official threatening first strike. But what's undeniable is that military policy think tank analysts are very seriously considering and pitching the idea of a first strike. That's what they're doing with a lot of these missiles that they're sending to Ukraine, these advanced ATACMS and such, is they are sending them to hit Russia far behind the lines in alleged anticipation of Russia using those troops and those supplies to further attack Ukraine. And so it's not a far leap of logic for NATO themselves to start striking these in anticipation of some sort of alleged attack against a NATO facility or personnel officially.
So that reminds me of the recent thing that we've been hearing, and I don't know if this is real or not, or if this is true, but I've been seeing just rumblings online that some people are considering giving nuclear weapons to Ukraine. Is that true?
Yeah, of some very radical fringes, but some people with enough proximity to power to find that sort of rhetoric pretty concerning. So one of the common talking points is that when the Soviet Union dissolved, a lot of the countries that were part of the Soviet Union that weren't Russia voluntarily gave up their nuclear arsenals, which were stationed by Soviet authorities in these countries on the periphery. And they gave them up in exchange for the understanding that they would be given security guarantees. And Ukraine was among them. They took a bunch of nukes that were in Ukraine out of Ukraine. And now Ukraine is regretting that decision because they see, Russia's special military operation, their invasion, as, violating the same sort of security guarantees they believed they had on account of giving up their nuclear weapons. And so the argument is, well, given that those security guarantees were violated, I guess we can have nukes again. Now, that's a radical step to take, but one where you can track the logic they're following, but it's nevertheless incredibly irresponsible. There is no scenario where I would want nuclear weapons placed back in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. I'm glad to hear that.
And I wouldn't want Russia placing nuclear weapons in their newly acquired territories in the former east of Ukraine and the south of Ukraine. I don't think they should be moving nukes in there either. And for a long while, the tentative status of those areas was a degree of autonomy within the Ukrainian state itself, some level of military de-escalation in these very particular areas of Ukraine. But the pro-Western Ukrainian government and many of its backers in the US and elsewhere overturned that temporary status quo there with the Minsk agreement and such. And so that's kind of how we landed where we are now. And there's so much finger pointing to go around on both sides of this. But, as an American, I truly just expect better from us in particular. And we have just acted egregiously when it comes to handling communications, diplomacy with Russia. That's really, maybe we could pull up a clip of it even, but Lavrov has a great bit where he talks about Russia's main problem being that the US and its allies try and force their sphere, their way of life, their ideas of what a fair diplomatic agreement looks like on Russia, on China, on the rest of the world, without any regard for national sovereignty. Russia is very big into the idea of countries all being equally sovereign, and they truly feel disrespected by the fact that America has treated them as nothing more than a roadblock in their, game of monopoly foreign policy, hegemony, you could call it.
Yeah, so here's a clip of Lavrov doing just that, pointing fingers at the hypocrisy of the West from his perspective. That they point to international law, but are themselves violating it.
The right for self-determination is the international legal basis for decolonization process, which took place in Africa on the basis of this charter principle, right for self-determination. The people in the colonies, they never treated the colonial powers, colonial masters, as somebody who represent them, as somebody whom they want to see in the structures which govern those lands. By the same token, the people in east and south of Ukraine, people in Donbass and Novorossiya, they don't consider the Zelensky regime as something which represents their interests. How can they, when their culture, their language, their traditions, their religion All this was prohibited.
Yes.
And so what he's getting at there is that I believe in a different part of the interview, he says that the United States and all of the countries it intervenes in points to human rights abuses and like the eradication of cultures in certain countries for justifying its intervention. But here he points to the fact that in Ukraine, certain religions are being outlawed, the Russian language itself is being outlawed, and that the United States does not mention the human rights abuses at all that are being done by Ukraine itself.
Well, yeah, and coming from a pretty radical libertarian perspective, this issue of decentralization of government, of self-determination and autonomy and consent of the governed, one of the most unfortunate parts of this whole conflict, in my mind, is the fact that in 2014 and those following years, there was a real opportunity, a real chance to have genuine, internationally, jointly monitored referendas, votes on whether these regions in eastern and southern Ukraine wanted to be part of Ukraine or wanted to be part of Russia. Russia has held referenda since, but they've come under a great amount of scrutiny given the circumstances of them, understandably so. But on the flip side, there was very little, if any, interest in the West to actually hold these votes, but most likely out of fear that they would choose to join Russia if given the option. These are regions where, we've dived into the history many times, as Putin did in his interview as well. These regions are Russian speaking, often ethnically Russian. They have ties to the Russian Orthodox Church. They are people who are not truly, in many of their hearts and minds, represented by the government in Kiev. They don't feel much attachment to the western half of Ukraine, but they do feel a great deal of attachment to Russia, whether that be from Russian Empire days or the Soviet days. And the West has just fully ignored and, kind of conveniently pushed to the side this issue of self-determination and consent of the governed. And my libertarian perspective is great. Let them vote. Let these people, these regions, these localities decide what best suits and represents them. Because I think every single community and region in the world should have that right to decentralize and pick who best represents them at any given point. But we rejected that idea. We rejected that opportunity and have now found ourselves in a position where even if they do happen, they're going to come under such great scrutiny because of what's already taken place. And right. So it's just such a lost opportunity for Russia and the US to have worked together. And that was the Russian proposal, at least on face value. You can say they were lying, but they were telling the American public and the American government, let's come to a joint security agreement for Ukraine. Let's actually talk about this as equal partners at a table and figure out how we can both come out of this without losing lives, without losing a great deal of money. Much of this really goes back to, and this is another great thing for libertarians, trade. Much of this goes back to Ukraine wanting to, go into this free economic zone, this tariff-free relationship with the European Union when they were already part of a tariff-free trade zone with Russia and many of the other post-Soviet states. And Russia proposed with the EU, well, let's talk this out. Maybe we can come to like a tripartite agreement. The three of us can have an agreement so that European goods aren't flooding Russian markets, that we both have access to Ukraine, that it's able to trade on both sides, the East and the West, with equal fair value. And the West essentially said, nah, no chance of that happening. They'll trade with who they want, and we're going to tell them who they want, and that's us. And so this is one of those situations where perhaps if goods had kept crossing these borders, troops would not be at this moment.
Yeah, and I have a clip here of Lavrov talking about the trade relationship with Ukraine and kind of how this all started.
Then we suggested to the European Union, guys, Ukraine is our common neighbor. You want to have better trade with Ukraine. We want the same. Ukraine want to have markets both in Europe and in Russia. Why don't we sit three of us and discuss it like grown-ups? The head of the European Council Commission was the Portuguese, Barroso was his name. And he responded, it's none of your business what we do with Ukraine. We, for example, we, the European Union, we don't ask you to discuss with us your trade with China. Absolutely arrogant answer.
I like how he, once again hints at the fact that many of these U.S. and Western diplomats and officials are acting childish. He said, let's be grown-ups at the table and actually talk this out, do our jobs as diplomats, and sort out an agreement where we all win in the end. We all get a slice of the pie that we're happy with. And we just threw our hands in the air and passed up the opportunity, ultimately, as we can see now in hindsight, to our detriment. And, Ukraine should be a thriving, prosperous country. They have incredible agricultural potential. They have significant industrial, strength, and they have plenty of natural resources of a variety of kinds. And there's no reason we couldn't bring those resources to markets in the East and the West. Everyone can benefit. Everyone can make money. This is the beautiful part of capitalism in a globalized system, is that if countries can responsibly handle that, everyone wins a little bit. And we decided that everyone is going to lose. The U.S. taxpayer is going to lose. Ukraine's economy and the lives of their young men, they're going to lose. Russia now, we forced them into a place where they had to make a move that's losing them a lot. And so the libertarian free market advocate in me just, feels a great deal of sorrow about this whole situation when I think about what could have been versus what is. And much of it does seem to be childish behavior on the part of our bureaucratic, our diplomatic establishment. And now we have people like Lindsey Graham pretty much openly, unapologetically talking about looting Ukraine of its natural resources as, a payback for everything the U.S. has done for it. And by what the U.S. has done for it, I mean sacrifice thousands and thousands and thousands of lives and bring us to the brink of nuclear war. So for doing that, Ukraine apparently owes us its minerals, according to the esteemed Senator Graham.
I have this clip of Senator Graham talking about why we need to continue the war in Ukraine. And it really is sad that it seems to actually boil down to, like you said, like just a fundamental misunderstanding of the economy and how it works and the benefits of trade. I mean, instead of just figuring out how we can both have the minerals of the country, why don't we just bomb Ukraine and use them as cannon fodder against Russia? But here's Lindsey Graham talking about why he believes we should continue this war. And he tweets, Ukraine has trillions of dollars worth of critical minerals in their country. Vladimir Putin cannot be allowed to access that money and those resources because he will share it with China. And here's the clip.
What did Trump do to get the weapons flowing? He created a loan system. They're sitting on $10 to $12 trillion of critical minerals in Ukraine. They could be the richest country in all of Europe. I don't want to give that money and those assets to Putin to share with China. If we help Ukraine now, they can become the best business partner we ever dreamed of. That $10 to $12 trillion of critical mineral assets could be used by Ukraine and the West, not given to Putin and China. This is a very big deal how Ukraine ends. Let's help them win a war we can't afford to lose. Let's find a solution to this war. But they're sitting on a gold mine to give Putin $10 or $12 trillion of critical minerals that he will share with China is ridiculous.
All right, so there's his justification. And then we actually had Lavrov responding to this. He brought him up by name, which I did not expect because maybe he was listening to some previous episodes from Tucker Carlson, where Tucker has also bashed Graham, but he also criticized him and this argument that the reason we need to continue the war in Ukraine is because of resources, and he compared Russia's interest with the United States' interest. So here's Lavrov.
They fight for keeping their hegemony over the world, on any country, any region, any continent. We fight for our legitimate security interests. They say, for example, 1991 borders. Lindsey Graham, who visited some time ago Zelensky for another talk, he bluntly, in presence of Zelensky, I think, said that Ukraine is very rich with rare earth metals, and we cannot leave this richness to the Russians. We must take it. We fight, so they fight for the regime which is ready to sell or to give to the West all the natural and human resources. We fight for the people who have been living on these lands, whose ancestors were actually developing those lands, building cities, building factories for centuries and centuries. We care about people, not about natural resources, which somebody in the United States would like to keep and to have Ukrainians just as servants sitting on these natural resources.
Yeah, it was shocking, although once again, not unsurprising, to hear Lindsey Graham admit that we can't afford to lose this war. That, the US has put so much into this. Ukraine, NATO as a whole, all these Western European countries have invested so much of their resources, so much of their time and attention and global political capital on this conflict, that they truly are in like a sunk cost fallacy situation where if they concede at all, if they give an inch, it's going to feel like they gave a mile because of how much we've recklessly focused our foreign policy and our military policy on continuing and escalating this conflict. And, Lavrov was obviously being very, very, pro-Russian in his stance, talking about how they're fighting for the people and not industry and resources. And to a certain extent, I do believe that he genuinely believes that, and that is absolutely the case in some situations. But it's also not a coincidence that much of Ukraine's industrial infrastructure and lots of its natural resources are in the eastern half of the country. The Donbass was known as a big industrial center, especially with coal and mining and that sort of stuff. And so once again, this demonstrates why Russia and Ukraine and the West should have all been cooperating when these regions were initially the subject of contention, to find a way where the regions can stay safe and secure. They can harness their full potential, their economic potential, their productivity, and how it could benefit people on either side of it. How some of that, economic benefit would go to Ukraine and then would funnel over to Europe. Part of it would cross that immediate border right over into Russia. Russia was trying to work on creating like trade agreements between those parts of eastern Ukraine and the regions right on the other side of the border, like a special sort of trade relationship. And we gave that all up. If Lindsey Graham really cared about getting those minerals to market, he would have worked to bring them to market instead of trying to loot them from a destroyed country. It's insane to think about, once again, just what could have been. Because he's right, Ukraine could be the richest country in Europe. And instead, we have made it a battered, poor hellhole who has lost thousands of men, whose women and children have fled, and that's going to cost a great deal of money, billions, if not trillions, to fully rebuild, when we could have just been trickling out billions and later trillions of economic activity from the country if we had just been adults at the table. Not to take Lavrov's points, but he's 100% right on that. We could have been businessmen at the table, like Trump might be. Maybe this would be a good segue into Lavrov's comments about Trump, where he's looking at it from a perspective of how can we remove roadblocks to what we want. If we want minerals, is it going to be easier to remove the roadblock of some trade deals and do a little bit of technical work there? Or is it going to be a bigger roadblock to try and regime change Ukraine, give a super pro-Western government, tear them away, get them in NATO, and then take all of their resources as repayment for prying them away from this Russian sphere? One of those roadblocks sounds much easier, and it's just to pursue a business relationship. Once again, we don't have to be best friends with Russia. We don't have to be best friends with NATO or with Ukraine or with anyone. We can be the American business, the American people, the American Leviathan, and deal in a way that's good for us without pissing off everyone else who's also just acting in self-interest. But what the problem with American adventurism and foreign policy is they're trying to force their ambitions on everyone else with not even, in an adequate amount, but an entire absence of thought about how other countries are going to feel and react. They truly believe that America is at the center of the world, the center of the universe even. And all Russia has been trying to do is remind them that there are other countries on this planet, and these other countries also have nuclear weapons, so maybe calm down a bit. But it doesn't look like we're willing to calm down, at least for the next, 40-ish days that Biden's president.
Yeah, and this war is going to be expensive in numerous ways. Also, I think the biggest problem is that the leaders of our country had this hubris that the world would sort of just rally around the United States, and that, if we just impose sanctions, Russia would respond like every other country we bully has responded in the past. And Tucker brought up, speaking of peace deals and potential peace deals that Trump would broker, Tucker brought up the possibility of removing sanctions on Russia and whether that would alleviate Russia's concerns and whether they would come to the table on that. And Lavrov essentially said, because you impose these sanctions, we turned east. And
it's too late.
It's too late. So here's that clip.
Would dropping sanctions against Russia be a condition?
I would say probably many people in Russia would like to make it a condition, but the more we live under sanctions, the more we understand that it is better to rely on yourself and to develop mechanisms, to develop platforms for cooperation with normal countries who are not unfriendly to you, and don't mix economic interest and policies, and especially politics.
That's so interesting. It almost is very libertarian in a sense to be like, stop mixing your politics with business, your economic policy with your socio-political policy.
Yeah, and Tucker pressed him on this and said, like, is there any opportunity that you would, create a relationship with the United States in the future? Just like questioning him on this point of it being too late. And Lavrov brought up the fact that they're kind of considering economic partnerships with China through BRICS. So the secondary consequences, again, of this war, that the dollar is potentially threatened because through this sanctions regime that we've used across the world, it has incentivized countries to look elsewhere and to look to alternatives. So here's Tucker asking him about that.
Why not bring Russia into a Western bloc, sort of as a balance against the rising East? But it doesn't seem like that. Do you think that's still possible?
I don't think so. Recently, Putin was speaking at Valdai Club. Politologists and experts. He said we would never be back at the situation of early 2022. That's when he realized for himself, apparently, not only he, but he spoke publicly about this, that all attempts to be on equal terms with the West have failed. It started after the demise of the Soviet Union. There was euphoria. We are now part of the liberal world, the democratic world, end of history. But very soon it became clear to most of the Russians that in the 90s we were treated at best as junior partner, maybe not even as a partner, but as a place where the West can organize things like it wants.
Now, I'm only a few chapters into Scott Horton's new book, Provoked, but I mean, it really is like what he's talking about is what Scott details so greatly in the book about how the West sort of just deceived Russia into believing that they could have a partnership, that they misled Russia into thinking that there was an organization like the Partnership for Peace that would become prioritized over NATO, and that NATO would actually be de-emphasized over time and would just be like sort of like this economic relationship, and that Russia would be incorporated and a voice in the Partnership for Peace. But as Scott details, all of this was a lie, and it seems like Putin had a lot of patience, but it took him about 22 years to figure out that the West was lying to him, or I guess he finally concluded that.
It's so interesting in that vein that he name drops the end of history, because it really is. It's such a salient point about what Russia's doing, is what they've been doing ever since they kind of realized that the West wasn't their friend, is they've been trying to prove time and time again that this is not the end of history, that civilization, societies, countries are still competing on the world stage in this very realist sense. And perhaps that's why these Western diplomats, these American politicians felt as though they could rip off Russia, that, they could fold it seamlessly into the Western sphere, because they thought they had the literal force of history on their side. They may have been true believers in the fact that liberal democracy everywhere, including Russia, is inevitable. So we'll just do whatever we want now because they'll be on our side just as a matter of fact. It's almost like they're almost Marxists in that sense, that they think there's a theory of history that's just 100% true behind them, giving them momentum. And, right now we've halted any momentum we thought there was about the so-called end of history. And what Russia and, Lavrov are suggesting is that we move on to this phase of so-called multipolarity, where all the different countries in the world kind of respect one another to do as they please, to have the forms of governments and economic and social policy that best suits them as distinct cultural national entities, and that they try to minimally interfere with all these other countries. It's very idealistic in a sense, and you could even argue that Russia and China, who push this multipolarity narrative, are being deceiving, that they really just want a unipolar world with them at the helm. But I think Russia realizes that they have no chance of being unipolar power. You might be able to make that case for China if you are really like a huge pro-China advocate, but Russia has to surely realize they can't govern the world, even in the sense that the US has managed since the fall of the Soviet Union and their pseudo-hegemony that they've been trying to hold on to. So it's just so interesting to me that he specifically name drops end of history as a thesis of the American foreign policy establishment, which has been almost entirely rejected by the facts of reality.
Yeah, and of course he's citing Francis Fukuyama's idea that liberal democracy and this liberal idea of free markets that will kind of install capitalists within Russia had succeeded after the Cold War, and that finally the United States was on top, and that we had reached the end of history where we could impose our will. And I think they really did get high on the idea that, regime change, that the United States could go around and regime change countries, but they had never engaged with a country of the size of Russia. And I think that they were
think about the 90s and the early 2000s as a very nostalgic, great time to be an American, to be living the Western lifestyle. But I have time and again urged people to understand how chaotic and shitty the 90s were in Russia, the early 2000s even. The mob was ruling pretty much everything. People had their savings, their pensions wiped out. People were dying en masse just from, what they call deaths of desperation, alcoholism, drug abuse, suicide was just rampant. It was not a happy, nostalgic time to be in the post-Soviet sphere in the 1990s and early 2000s. And so that's one of the big reasons why we have Putin in power right now, with the popularity and the grip he has on the nation, is we made it so chaotic in the 90s and did very little to remedy the situation, only to capitalize on it, that when a leader with a strong hand came along who promised stability and to be respected on the national stage again, Russians latched onto that because they felt disrespected and exploited, and they just wanted some semblance of stability and pride back. Circling around to the idea of how Americans and Russians are similar, we both have a great deal of pride in our countries, even when we're super critical of it. So Russians on average don't tend to be at least openly super political people. They're not going to be diehard, pro-Putin, pro-Russian patriots, online, MAGA posting, with Putin instead of Trump. But you challenge them on their country and its worth and its value on the world stage, its contributions to history, and they will come after you. They are a very proud culture and people. And in that sense, they're like Americans. As critical as I am of the United States and of the West, it's only because of how much I love it and how proud I am of what it has done and how much potential I see in what it can be. And I think smart Russians and smart Americans realize, for the sake of the universe, as Lavrov pointed, we almost have an obligation to work together and to cooperate and to keep this planet spinning without big mushroom clouds popping out from its surface. And, if we were to imagine with the United States and Russia's scientific potential combined, especially in the area of space exploration, right? So U.S. foreign policy has been described as adventurism. They just go out looking for a thrill, looking for something to do because it's kind of boring out there. Well, yeah, there's no more of the planet to explore, but let's point towards the stars then. Why are we fighting over some land in Ukraine when the U.S. and Russia combined, even with China thrown in, could have the most glorious technological program, international cooperative agency ever? Throw Elon Musk in there. We have so much scientific and economic and human potential behind our three countries with the rest of the world combined, and we just throw it away willy-nilly because we want everyone to be wearing blue jeans like us and listen to pop music. I don't know exactly what our goal is with maintaining hegemony, because clearly security isn't it, because we are not any more secure with the American global empire than we are without it.
I mean, I really do think it is that people are late to finding out that the United States does not have supreme control over the world, that they cannot be the police power of the world, and that really this was the last ditch effort to establish hegemony and this end of history theory to kind of establish it as a real thing by trying to take out Russia. I do think that the facts on the ground just make it makes it seem as if their goal was to regime change Russia, and they thought they could do it. They thought that they could just impose a sanctions regime on them, and that they could fund an insurgency on their border, and that they would finally dominate Europe and would eventually be able to check China. I think that's honestly what it was. And like you said, Putin demonstrated that history has not ended, and that there are multiple countries. And now, of course, we have BRICS that is competing with the dollar as a result. And it's just, it's the consequence of their hubris. The ultimate end of the end of history is the end of history. And that if you try and force the end of history, you will end history by virtue of nuclear war. It's just, if you try and force this vision down the throats of the world, you're going to be having missiles fired at you before you reach that end of history that you so desire. It's just, we are at an inflection point and a reflection point. And I think the responsible course of action, hopefully that the Trump administration will undertake, is to just talk with Russia like they are a fellow adult at the table. Maybe that narcissism of our foreign policy, that we're the center of the universe, is because we are a young country and we haven't had to have these big highs and lows, these rise and falls of our civilization and our nation, and that we need to kind of have this, like this geopolitical teenage experience of understanding that everyone else is a sentient, conscious being with their own wills and ambitions and desires too, and that if we just go about life not respecting and understanding that, we're going to get our ass kicked eventually. Yeah, so on the point about Trump and what he's capable of doing, Tucker did ask him about the peace deal, so we'll wrap it up with this final clip.
This time, President Trump was elected on the explicit promise to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. So, he said that in appearance after appearance. So given that, there is hope for a resolution, it sounds like. What are the terms to which you'd agree?
Well, the terms, I basically alluded to them when President Putin spoke in this ministry on the 14th of June. He once again reiterated that we were ready to negotiate on the basis of the principles which were agreed in Istanbul and rejected by Boris Johnson, according to the statement of the head of the Ukrainian delegation. The key principle is no non-block status of Ukraine, and we would be ready to be part of the group of countries who would provide collective security guarantees to
no
Ukraine.
NATO.
No NATO, absolutely. No military bases. No military exercises on the Ukrainian soil with participation of foreign troops. And this is something which he reiterated. But of course, he said it was April 2022. Now some time has passed. And the realities on the ground would have to be taken into account and accepted. The realities on the ground are not only the line of contact, but also the changes in the Russian constitution after referenda was held in Donetsk, Lugansk republics and Kherson and Zaporozhye regions.
That non-block status seems like such a simple ask. You know, they're not saying Ukraine as a whole entity has to be in the Russian sphere, has to be like a Russian satellite state. It just can't be in NATO. You know, it can be a neutral actor that almost could serve as a positive bridge between the East and West. That's something else that Lavrov touched on, was that it's fine to be pro-Western, it's fine to be pro-Eastern, and the only thing that's not okay is forcing other countries to pick one side or the other and labeling them as the enemy if they pick the side counter to you. It really doesn't seem like that much of an ask. Now, I understand the people who are very, very sympathetic to Ukraine and believe that they shouldn't have to give a single inch because they are just a victim in all this. And in many senses, they are truly a victim of a proxy war between Russia and the United States, between the West and Russia. And so I do feel incredible sympathy and sadness for the situation in the country. But like Lavrov said, there are now realities on the ground that you can't go back from. You know, there are things where you just simply can't walk them back, and you can only move forward having taken them into account. And in my mind, Ukraine has the best path towards prosperity if it can reach a deal where they're getting Russian investment and money to help rebuild and Western money to help rebuild, and that there can be a synthesis of these systems that have competed so long in Ukraine, and it can be a model for how we deal with all these other countries. You know, do we really think all these countries in Africa and these little Indo-Pacific islands in South America that they want to have to choose between Russia and China, you know, the BRICS bloc and the NATO bloc? No, like any reasonable business countries, they want to be in both realms. They want to have a foot in both pools, because in the modern world, with geography being, you know, not as limiting as it was, there's no reason not to try and be in every single market possible, to have diplomatic and economic ties with every country possible, to keep things cordial and friendly. Doesn't mean you have to be best friends, just that you're not actively working against the interests of someone else, just to try and get yourself a slightly bigger piece of the pie. You know, understanding the cost-benefit analysis, not only for your own country, but everyone else that will be impacted in this complex system, this network of nations on this planet.
So I'm just wondering, to kind of wrap it up here, on a final note, you know, I'm wondering how optimistic you are, what you think the future looks like, and also, like, you have been personally impacted by this war, and this goes back to a piece that you published with antiwar.com about your time with Sputnik News. And, you know, on previous podcasts, you had also talked about how you know people in Russia personally from your time being over there, and that you have this concern for people who could potentially be drafted in a prolonged war. So I'm just wondering, with all of that in mind, all that context, what your outlook is and how you're feeling about the future.
Look, my optimism surged and renewed when Trump won the election in November. Now, I am not all aboard the Trump train, especially when it comes to foreign policy. I have my reservations given what happened in his first administration, but I am very optimistic that he will pursue at least a significantly better path and method than the Biden administration has. The fact that he did, repeatedly promise to put an end to this conflict, to speak personally with both Zelensky and Putin, and that he's really driven himself as a peace first candidate, in America first, in the sense that it really is. I'm filled with optimism, and I'm also made more optimistic by what Tucker Carlson is doing. When I worked at Sputnik, when I first started there all the way to the very last day, my goal was to do what he's essentially doing here. I wanted to help foster dialogue between the Russian and American people, between Russian and American officials. I wanted to be able to take the most significant, substantial points of American officials and get them into Russian hands. I wanted to be able to take, the most meaningful lines from Russian officials and put them in American hands. And Sputnik was a great avenue to do that for any other qualms you may have about the organization and its ties to Russia. Carlson, like myself, realized that you don't have to fully agree with someone or fully agree with an entity in order to see where they bring value and where you can make a difference from the inside. He went into Russian government buildings, sat across from, looked them in the eye, and asked them tough questions, and then put it out there for the world to see. That's what a good journalist does. That's what I strive to do. And the Biden administration is so cowardly that they shut us down out of fear that people might hear exactly what they just heard from Tucker Carlson, that they might hear directly from Russian officials, that they may get a perspective that's outside that which is pushed by the mainstream media. They said that is so dangerous to us. That could tear down our entire American system. The fabric of democracy will be shredded if we let American readers read stories tied to anything to do with Russia. It's the most ludicrous attack on freedom of the press, freedom of exchange, on diplomatic journalism, whatever that may mean. And so I'm glad that even though we were shut down, that they have tried to put earmuffs over the American public when it comes to information from the Russian sphere, that Carlson continues to actively defy them and set the stage here, with any luck, for a increasingly peaceful and prosperous relationship with Russia and Ukraine alike through the Trump administration's actions. I will certainly be holding them equally as accountable as I held the Biden administration for their actions. If Trump takes a wrong path, I'll be the first one to call him out on it. But for the time being, I'm optimistic. I hope he restores the ability of news organizations like Sputnik to put the words of people like Lavrov into, the screens of Americans out there, because it's not a threat to democracy. The biggest threat is the threat to world peace, stability, and security by blocking informational flows from people to people. We can understand each other if we talk, if we're adults at the table. And the Biden administration has put on a parental censorship device onto, Americans' phones, onto their internet access, and said, no, you can't look at these bad sites. Those are only diplomats are allowed to hear from other foreign government officials or something. I don't know. They think you need a security clearance to be able to handle an alternative perspective. And it's just so ludicrous and sad. If the Trump administration can do something about it quick and early, I think it'll help them steer the conflict towards a peaceful resolution. I think the longer we have a blockage of communication between Russian American people, Russian American media, the longer it'll take for the government's respective actions to have meaningful impact. We need the journalistic class, we need the Tuckers of the world to translate what the highest levels of power are doing to the average person. Because if we don't know, then we can only be guessing what our own government is doing. We don't have the full picture. We can't make informed decisions. And so we have a right and a responsibility to learn as the public what all of these foreign adversaries are doing. Because if we live in ignorance, we're going to stumble into something very, very bad.
Now, what exactly was the policy that led to Sputnik being shut down? What did the Biden administration do?
So there was a number of avenues they used to go after Russian media. So one of which is just cutting off their financial ties. They try and sanction all of the Russian banks, all of the entities that could perform business transactions to fund, the operations of Sputnik and other organizations in the United States. They targeted our top editors, the heads of the organization, with personal sanctions. They accused multiple elements of Russian news organizations of being, government agents, being actively involved in like specific detailed misinformation, disinformation, influence operations, whatever an influence operation means. I'm still not entirely clear on that. And so they use these combinations of, sanctions through the Treasury Department, diplomatic sanctions through the State Department, criminal action through the Justice Department, to kind of take a multi-pronged approach to just shut down the ability of Russian outlets to operate. Part of the difficulty for Sputnik was understanding whether they could even operate in the United States. It took weeks and weeks of legal analysis to come to a conclusion on whether we should continue operating in the United States. And ultimately, the conclusion was the risk is too high. The sanctions are broad enough, they cover enough areas that they could essentially decide to go after you for sanctions violations at any moment they wanted to. And so it was actually at least framed as being for the safety of our journalists, our American and Russian staff alike, that they shut down operations only because they were unsure whether the Biden administration would go after us. I don't know how that analysis will change under the Trump administration once he's inaugurated, whether that risk analysis will change and they'll say the Trump administration is unlikely to pursue charges in this nature, unlikely to go after you for potential sanctions violations. But as it stands, all these outlets have just determined that the Biden administration's sanctions are so broad and so all-encompassing for anything related to Russia that it's just impossible to do business in the United States at this point.
So it sounds like what you're saying is there was an actual concern that yourself and all other American journalists that were working at Sputnik were at potential risk just because of how broad this was, that you potentially had financial or criminal penalties.
Yeah, that's what we were told at the very least.
For free speech.
Yes, for engaging in genuine, totally legitimate journalistic activities. Once again, I can't speak for every echelon of Sputnik, from the editors in chief on down, but I can tell you that the team of journalists that I worked with in the newsroom for the Sputnik Newswire specifically were all legitimate, sincere journalists. They weren't involved in, detailed influence operations. They weren't actively trying to go and spread misinformation and disinformation. They were honest to God reporters, just doing their job, just trying to bridge this gap between American audiences and Russian audiences, Russian officials and American officials, to try and cover news just like Reuters and AP do. Those were our direct competitors. We saw ourselves as the Reuters, the AP, the Bloomberg wire of Russia. And the Biden administration decided that we were dangerous enough to, surround us with the risk and the potential of criminal and financial liability for the act of journalism. I reached out and talked to a couple different First Amendment scholars and legal organizations, and even they ultimately reached the same conclusion, which is that it appears on the surface to be a direct attack on freedom of the press, but the sanctions and the way they went about suppressing our ability to operate is so ambiguous and unclear that there's not a clear-cut case to be made on where exactly the suppression of journalism came from. It's if anything very nefarious that they didn't just come out and openly carte blanche sanction all Russian media and just explicitly shut us down. They had to do it through these sort of multi-pronged, vague means, potentially to try and lure us into a trap. And that's why the lawyers said it's not worth the risk to continue operations. Even trying to pay us would, cause problems, because if you receive a single penny from the wrong account, the Justice Department is going to come after you, regardless of if you have any idea what that account was, why it matters. You're just a journalist trying to get paid for journalism. It's really sad, and I feel worse for some of my other coworkers. John Kiriakou, the CIA whistleblower, worked at Sputnik because other news organizations wouldn't touch him. They didn't want to be associated with someone who exposed negative behavior by the United States government. And now he's, out of the last outlet that tried to allow him to tell the Untold, to be a voice critical of the United States government. And So, I'm not the only one impacted. I'm, young, on my feet, have a bright future ahead of me. But that can't be said for everyone who worked there. And the Biden administration is directly responsible for shutting down their aspirations as journalists, for taking away their livelihood, literally taking the food out of journalists' mouth and the mouths of their children, because you're worried something they might say could shred the fabric of American democracy, that misinformation and disinformation will tumble, our society to the ground under, Russian influence. It's just so ridiculous. It's infuriating just to think that there's enough people in the United States government who believe that maybe it is that weak. If our democracy is so weak that alternative opinions can tear it down, maybe it ought to be torn down. But I think we're stronger than that. So I'm ashamed that my government said no to any journalistic activity linked to Russia.
Yeah. And it just goes to show, the parallels with, sanctions and their impact on foreign aid, and the ability for people to actually provide aid to countries, and just how, like you said, it's ambiguous. And a lot of these aid organizations refuse to even bring aid into certain countries due to sanctions. And it just has this chilling effect. And it also reminds me just like the fact that free speech is always, I think it's threatened most in times of war. Like we have parallels in Montana where, I think we had some of the strictest sedition laws in the country during World War I, where there was a guy in Red Lodge who got arrested simply because he was eating and he made a joke about ration laws. And so I think, I guess to end on this note, I think the one white pill from this entire year, and the lesson that we kind of learned from this year, is that alternative media won out. And I think that 2024 and the election in particular, with Donald Trump going on all of these platforms and having that be really the thing that gives him the momentum to win in the way that he did, just shows that the corporate press and the old ways of controlling information are dying. And I think Tucker's interview with Lavrov is just another indication of that maybe in the future, the pathway to peace is not relying on, public diplomats, but actually like private journalists going overseas and interviewing these people so that Americans can hear from the other leaders and hear the other side, because so often it's been the government controlling the channels of information to put out propaganda, to get people to buy stories like the Ghost of Kiev. And ultimately, I think that it's the control of information that leads us to war. And hopefully the lessons and the fact that Tucker's doing this just means that the chances for peace are higher.
We absolutely all owe a debt of gratitude to people like Tucker, who are risking a lot to conduct interviews like this at the moment. We owe a great deal to people like Scott Horton, who have compiled everything you need to know, everything that the government didn't want you to know in the last several decades as it relates to the U.S.-Russia relationship. He put in a book and put it out there, and people love it, right? It is a best-selling book because people now are waking up. They're watching interviews like this one between Tucker and Lavrov, like the Putin interview, and they're realizing that they were not told the whole story, that they didn't understand the full picture, that this didn't all just start in 2022 with the invasion of Ukraine, that this is a long story that needs to be told. And it could have been told if we had bolstered these people-to-people ties. That's what, private diplomacy is, essentially just people-to-people ties. When we can have ordinary Russian and American businessmen, Russian and American athletes, Russian and American musicians and journalists interacting on the regular, that's where you get the strongest foundation for true diplomacy, truly strong, cordial relations between countries, because their governments will reflect those people-to-people ties of their citizenries. And so, if people like Tucker Carlson continue doing this, if people like Scott Horton continue to exist, and if people like you keep having these great podcasts, eventually I think we'll get there, and we can learn to thrive and prosper with other countries instead of try and wage a strategic battle with them on the world stage. The world and the universe is big enough for all of us, frankly. I know that sounds very like bleeding heart liberal, but it's true. The US and the Russia don't just have this planet to share. We have the stars to share. And hopefully this interview is one of many steps that leads us away from nuclear war, away from missiles and towards rocket ships.
Well, your voice on this is certainly one of the most important. You have been a consistent voice on this, and you're extremely knowledgeable on it. And I'm sure many people are going to want to know where they can follow your stuff, and they're going to want to know what you're doing after your time at Sputnik. So why don't you tell people where they can find you and what you're going to be doing in the future?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter or X at Posts from Underground at _posts. I put articles there now. I moved away from Medium. I have a great collection of tweets, always put out clips from interviews like this. Great content there on Twitter. Check out my album Nuclear Sponge if you're interested in the idea of getting nuked here in the middle America. Did a whole concept album on that. And I'm doing some great things professionally. I'm going to keep them on the down low for the moment, but it's been a fun time. When one door closes, many others open. So I'm looking forward to the future. You will keep hearing my voice, reading my words out there on the internet on these non-interventionist issues. And in the months and years to come, I think you'll see a lot more of me out there.
Great to hear, and we'll definitely have to have you back on the show. Thank you so much, Ethan. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Liam. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning into the Liam McCullum Show, a podcast by Human Reaction. Check out the Human Reaction weekly podcast hosted by Joe Sheehan, David Rand, and Kyle Mack. And make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to both of our channels.